something that the angels did that was wrong, and because of that, God cast them down into gloomy darkness, says, committed them to chains of gloomy darkness. Perhaps this is the third that we know fall after Satan in Revelation, or we don't know entirely what's going on. That there's a lot of really fun ideas that people have brought forward. Anyway, and then in verse 5 says, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Having the idea here of the ancient world, for one thing, this large group of people that were destroyed, who got what was coming to them, and also Noah, who was saved because he did believe in God and because he was righteous before him. And then in verse 6 we have, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. We have there that example of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in verse 7 and 8, Lot being rescued. It says, if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. And then in verse 9, we have kind of what he's getting to here with all of these examples that he's given. And all of these very carefully chosen examples. He says, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the righteous under punishment until the day of judgment. And so when we think back, we don't know just a ton about the angels. But we do know a good amount about the flood, and we know a good amount about Sodom and Gomorrah. Think back to the time of the flood. Did God wait until like half of the people on the earth were ungodly, and then he was like, all right, now we're gonna finish it. Now it's not good. Now we're gonna have a flood. No. He waited until the whole earth was filled with wickedness, aside from those 8 souls. And he saved those. He didn't abandon them to be destroyed with the rest, but he saved them, even knowing that they were going to mess up in the future, and even knowing that coming down their line, there were going to be individuals who did terrible things. But he saved them because they were righteous. Specifically, Noah was righteous before God. And so we have an idea here of God's patience that's being introduced. And that's going to come up again later on. But he is making sure that there is the distinction that there will be a punishment for the unrighteous, just as there was in the old times. And then, so we have there the flood of God's patience and waiting until, first off, that the whole earth was wicked except for Noah and the 8. Then also Sodom and Gomorrah, a very similar kind of thing. We think about whenever Abraham interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah, he goes down from something like 50 all the way down to 10, where he's talking about if there were 10 righteous souls, just 10, between Sodom and Gomorrah, would you destroy it, or would you leave it alone for the sake of those 10? And God says, I wouldn't destroy it for the sake of those 10 righteous souls. And so he's got this patience that's being expressed here of God. And this will be going on to chapter 3, verse 8, where he's talking about don't overlook the fact that with the Lord is one day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day, and that the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. And so this idea is beginning to be brought up here in chapter 2, and that he is going to be patient, and that he's not wanting for anybody to be left out, and not wanting any of the wheat to be ripped up with the tares. And so he's introducing this idea to help combat the doctrines of the false teachers who are saying, okay, he hasn't come yet. When's he going to come, if not now? And they're throwing out the whole idea of Jesus' second coming, even challenging perhaps that God exists at all. And so he's is combating this idea by bringing up these examples of the olden times. We're in verse 9. He says, "Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the righteousness under punishment until the day of judgment." The language there is a little bit tricksy because, I mean, immediately you're thinking about an idea of keeping the righteousness under punishment, or keeping the unrighteous and the ungodly under punishment until the day. But obviously, we look at some of the wickedness of the world, and it's talked about elsewhere in the Bible, and it seems like they're kind of living it up. And we look at, they're not really under any kind of any punishment as we would see it in this world. But the idea is going to be that God has reserved a punishment for them, and He will keep them there. And it's kind of almost like the idea of a holding cell is the only way that I can think of to rectify it with the rest of Scripture. And it makes sense to me. I'd like to know what y'all think about it here in a moment, but and maybe know a little bit more. But the idea that He has reserved a punishment for them and that He is going to keep them for that time. And then in verse 10 he says, "Especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority." So we have lust and defiling passion expressed here, tying back to the sensuality described in chapter 2, verse 2, and also ties in a little bit with the example of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is specifically mentioned in verse 8, where or 7 and 8, where Lot is living in this area of sensual conduct and resisting it. Anyway, and so he's saying these people who are just living how they want to live, who are indulging in their own lusts and their own desires, these individuals who are rebelling against authority, they're not going to be without punishment, and their destruction is not idle. And so he's making this assurance that they are going to get what's coming to them, and he does so with all of these great illustrations from the Old text, from the Old Testament, and some of the examples that they knew. So before we continue on to the rest of verse 10 and continue along to some more poetic descriptions of the false teachers, do you have any comments or questions?
People are still living this way every day.
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and it's not. And back in the day, I mean, there were the Epicureans that Paul talked to, Mars Hill, and all of that, talking about with some of these philosophers who had the idea that, well, you know, this life, it doesn't really matter. You can't change the past. Eventually, you're not going to have any effect on the future. And so you may as well live it up. You may as well do what you want to do. Live how you want to live.
The self-will strikes
Yeah.
out to me. Yeah.
I mean, they're just, yeah. And I mean, it harkens back to Judges, where every man was doing as he willed. And again, it has that kind of idea of despising authority. They're not looking at what anybody else wants or needs, but looking to follow what they want to do, their own lusts and passions.
Technology has changed. What's the verse? I can't think. There's nothing new under the sun.
Under the sun, Ecclesiastes?
Is it Ecclesiastes?
Yes.
Okay.
Something about
There's nothing new. The way to sin has changed with the technology, but it's still the same sins. I mean,
Absolutely.
nothing new. I mean,
Yeah. And I mean, like you said, there's the ways that we go about it, and perhaps the amount to which our own passions and desires are pursued has changed a little bit.
yeah.
But the sin is still there,
Mhm.
and it's still, I mean, it's changed. But yeah, it's not changed. It's not any different from back then.
On the part you talked about them being reserved for punishment, you could look at it as the situation in a trial. after you're found guilty, there's generally a time before the punishment is sentenced.
The holding cell. You're right.
Yeah, sometimes you're not even in prison during that time, and I think that's probably the easier way to look at it for the ungodly, is they have been found guilty because they have sinned, but their final judgment hasn't been pronounced yet until the day of judgment. So we may see them living it up, but their fate is sealed unless they repent. And I think that's what Peter's getting at there, is God isn't going to let them off the hook. They're under punishment.
Yeah.
Now, even though they may be living in a way that we don't see them in punishment.
Yeah.
They are deserving and will get punishment. So that's one way to look at it, I think, is it's not this world
Yeah.
that we worry about.
Yeah. Out on probation.
Not even probation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're waiting the sentence.
Yeah. And I mean, that makes a lot of sense with the language used in 3 verse 7, where he's saying, talking about the heavens and the earth, says, but by the same word the heavens and the earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. Just like over in verse 9, he says they're kept, he's keeping the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. In the same way, I mean, obviously, our world isn't burning around us. And so, in like manner, they're not being punished in the way that we would see, just like you're saying, but they're being reserved for the day.
I think verse 10 also, they are presumptuous,
Oh, yeah.
self-willed. I think what we need to realize in this portion here is these ungodly people, these false teachers that were going to come in, they thought highly of themselves, more highly of themselves than God.
Yeah.
And he makes the comment that even the angels don't bring a reviling accusation against them before the Lord. The angels know their place, but these false teachers don't know their place. They will step out of their bounds as God's created and pretend to be God. And that is what we see in the world around us today. People who think they know more than their creator. Whether they admit they accept God or don't, they are bringing themselves to a point where they are God. They decide what is right or wrong. They decide how they were created, and they were created wrong as a male when they think they're a female. Or they were created wrong because they were a woman instead of a man. And all of that is being presumptuous, self-willed, thinking more highly of yourself than you should. And the scriptures teach that we should be giving God the ultimate authority, not trying to take it ourselves. And I think that's what these false teachers that you're going to get into in verse 4 or 12 and following really had as their problem.
Yeah.
They thought they were more like God than like man. And in verses 4 through 11, Peter is saying that's not the case. And he goes back to examples where people tried to do the same thing and how God took care of them.
Well, it's all tied in there with the idea that they're following after their own desires and they're following after their own lusts rather than doing what God has set for them to do. They're saying, this is right, this is what is good for me to do. I can live it up now. I can live how I want to live, enjoy my life, because the rest doesn't matter. It says they're denying the master who bought them. They're blaspheming the glorious ones, which, and we'll get there. And then later on, let's see, where is it? Eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin, down in 14, forsaking the right way. I mean, he's got all of these really poetic expressions of kind of these ideas of what they're doing. And down in verse 20 says, they've escaped the defilements of the world, but they've turned back. They're entangled again and overcome. Anyway, I think this is definitely tied in with that same idea. They're following after what they want to do. They're doing what they want to do rather than what God would have them do. They're putting themselves in the place of God in that way, saying this is fine and dandy. This is what's right, when in reality it's not. And they're making these bold assumptions.
And people try to point it out to them, but there's no way.
Well, and you mentioned too the idea that people today would put themselves in the place of God by saying, well, okay, I was born as a man or whatever, but that wasn't quite right, and so I'm going to transition. And I mean, in a lot of ways, it applies back to what you were saying earlier. The ways in which people engage in this kind of willful sin and putting themselves in the place of God has changed somewhat. Not even all that much, but it's the same kind of sin. It's the same kind of thing that they went through back in the day, and which is one of the beauties of God's word, in that it's applicable for all times. These same things, even though the methodology has changed somewhat, the same things still apply. All of these same sins that they dealt with and these same false teachers that they dealt with, we deal with now, just in slightly different forms. Any other comments, questions before we go on? Okay. So finishing up there in verse 10, we talked about some already. It says they're indulging in lust and defiling passion. They're despising authority. It says they're bold and willful, and they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. Some translations that y'all have got likely have, I believe it's angelic authorities. Is that what it says? Some translations. I want to say it does in the New American Standard. Could be wrong on that one. Anyway, that is, I had to look through some commentaries and things, see, because I had honestly no idea what this is talking about. Verse 10, there at the end. Sorry, is it? Yes, verse 10. Blaspheming the glorious ones. That phrase there, the glorious ones specifically.
Of 2?
2 verse 10. My translation says glorious ones.
Translated, speaking evil of dignitaries, of people in authority.
Mm-hmm. This has been translated so many different ways by different people. And truth be told, I don't know entirely what's the right way here. So I kind of go into a few different ways that I can see it, and just let y'all have it. But one is that idea of the dignitaries and people in authority. The phrase literally is, I did a little bit of digging on that. The phrase literally is the glorious ones. That would be a very, very close translation. As to what that actually means is a little bit more difficult. There are people who will say that it's angelic authorities fitting in with the idea of angels being brought up a few times in chapter 2 especially. First in chapter 2 verse 4, which would make that illustration a little bit more applicable. And then in a moment, which we referenced earlier, in verse 11, it is saying, whereas angels, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment, saying that these people here are blaspheming, they're going against, they're not respecting the angelic authorities, but the angels themselves don't blaspheme against them. So that's one way that some people I saw said it, and I can kind of see it. I'm always a little bit hesitant to just outright say, oh, it's angels, because we just don't know hardly anything about him. But the other is the earthly leaders and people, the dignitaries. Translation, or these are people who aren't respecting man's law. They're not respecting what has been set for them to do. These are unruly individuals, which fits in a lot of ways as well. They're following after their own passions. They have no respect either for God or for man's law. The third one, and this is the one that I lean a little bit more toward, is that they're not respecting the glorious ones, being the authority that God Himself has put forth. I lean this way. I'm not going to say this is it, because I can see it a lot of different ways here. And I really, this is one of the difficulties I always find in any kind of biblical study where it gets into the nitty gritty things like this. And in a lot of ways, this is why I kind of like to shy away from it. But at the same time, I don't like to have unanswered questions. But I don't have an answer for this one. And but if I know
if you
you're
look at the context and in the timing, what Peter was talking about, these people these false teachers, they were speaking evil of God's chosen, whether it was His Son. They were blaspheming and taking away Jesus as the Christ. They were saying that He didn't come as a human form. They were speaking evil against the apostles also. If you'll look at the context in this with the false teachers, I think those dignitaries, what is meant there is those who God has put into a place of authority.
Mm-hmm.
The angels cannot speak against that because God has done something above the angels. And we have examples where the angels wouldn't even condemn Satan.
Yeah.
But would simply say, God condemns you. The
angels
angels don't have that ability. And that's what he's saying there in verse 11. The angels who are even greater in power than these false teachers won't condemn Jesus, won't condemn the apostles, won't condemn the governors, those who God had put into charge. Because in the context of this false teaching, they're teaching against all those things. Not just the governments around them, but teaching against, as you mentioned in verse 4 or verse 2, Jesus, but they're even teaching against Peter and the other apostles there. So I don't think we have to say, and it's not right to say it's angelic powers, because there are no angelic powers, really. The angels are messengers. That's all that they were created to be.
Yeah.
And here, the emphasis in this whole chapter is on false teachers and what they were doing. So I think it's probably right, the fourth way or the third way that you've mentioned, looking at it as these are God's chosen authorities. And how often do we see people speak ill of God's chosen authorities today?
Well, and that I'm really glad you said that, because that was definitely the way I was wanting to lean. It's very difficult for me though. In part, I think just because I'm young and I haven't been through school.
You just have to look at the context. Angelic authorities doesn't make sense here.
Yeah.
Just because it's translated glories, that word I believe can be used in many different ways, but it's the ones that have been set above. So that would be anyone that is in a place of authority or rule.
Yeah, I have a difficult time saying, especially if I hear other people talking about, well, this is the way it is, this is the way it is. And I kind of almost want to just abandon the whole idea of commentaries because of this. Because I have a really difficult time saying, all right, this is wrong. This is objective. Yeah, anyway. So thank you. Any other comments there on that bit? Y'all have more to add? Okay. So go over blaspheming the glorious ones. And then verse 11, again, we talked about this already. It says, whereas angels, though they're greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. But these, says, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction. And so we're beginning to get into this language of which Peter is describing these coming false teachers and false prophets, saying, first off, we have up in verse 10 that they're bold and willful. They don't tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. And then we have our bit here with the angels contrasting these false teachers, these false prophets with these angels who, even though they're greater in power, just like we talked about, they don't blaspheme even against these individuals. And then verse 12 says they're like irrational animals. That's our third. Creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, and they will be destroyed in their destruction. And so, first we have in verse 12, irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed. These are individuals that have given up. I mean, one of the things that separates us from animals is our actions, our conscience, the things that guide us. And these people have abandoned that. They've abandoned the guides that God has put forth through His Word. They've abandoned the bounds that have been given, and they're just running loose. They're living however they want to live. They're acting like animals, creatures of instinct. And it says, born to be caught and destroyed. And then later on, he says they're going to be destroyed in their destruction. And again, coming back to the idea that just like, an animal is running loose, it's not acting right, that's acting irrationally, it's not the way it ought to be, they're going to be destroyed. And it's not even, and that they're going to be caught as well. They're not, again, hearkening back to the idea that God knows how to deal with the unrighteous and He knows how to deal with the righteous. And so we have creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed. They're blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant. And so
that's a bad translation.
Yeah.
I don't think ignorant should be used there. Ignorant kind of gives the impression of not knowing something. I think it's better that they speak against things they don't understand, as the King James and New King James translate.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're speaking evil because they don't understand.
Yeah.
It's not because they don't know.
Yeah. They knew about God. They knew about these things. They were called by the Master in verse 2, and they abandoned it, as we'll see later on down.
But
and so it's not that
to understand all of that. But understanding also goes back to the beast of the field. The brute beast, animals don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
They may know things, like my dog knows that I'm his master, but he doesn't understand things. And that's another thing that Peter's trying to get across here is these false teachers don't understand.
Which again goes back to the idea of growing in knowledge to combat these things and to combat these doctrines. And so I entirely agree 100% there. Because again, the idea that they didn't know anything at all, that they were ignorant of God, they were ignorant of Jesus, they were ignorant of these things, doesn't fit with anything that's talked about. But rather, this idea that they didn't understand the things of which they're talking about. They're speaking confidently about things that they didn't have the full picture on. And so they're saying
things that they chose not to understand.
Yeah.
We sometimes forget that you cannot understand something because you haven't learned enough, or you can misunderstand something because you've just chosen not to.
Mm.
And I think that fits with these false teachers a lot too, because they made a decision to turn from their master.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that is what it comes down to, is that they have made this choice. And because we've hit this a few times, they're choosing to ignore that, for one thing, God is a judge, or He does make judgment upon the unrighteous, just like all of these examples in the Old Testament. they're choosing to ignore all of these aspects about God's nature, and that He's patient and that He's willing to wait so that all would be saved. They're ignoring these areas of God's life and saying, well, it's been 40 years now, or longer, and Jesus still hasn't come back, so He's not going to. They're ignoring God's eternal nature. They're ignoring His patience and His willingness that all would be saved. And so they're turning to blaspheme God. They're blaspheming about things that they don't understand. They're choosing, I see what you're saying, that they're choosing to ignore these things they don't understand in that respect. And so, yes, thank you for that. We've got here, and they're blaspheming about matters which they don't understand, which they're ignorant of. And again, calling back to denying the master in verse 2 there. Or is that verse 1? No, that's verse 1. Okay. In verse 1 of the same chapter. And later on in verse 3, he'll call back to it again. So it says they're blaspheming about matters which they're ignorant, and they're going to be destroyed in their destruction. And so again, God's saying they're not going to get away with these things. They're not going to be able to blaspheme God. They're not going to be able to blaspheme the things that have been set forth and just get off scot-free. This is something that they will be judged for, and they will be destroyed for. And so these ideas, and then verse 13 says, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing, they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. Their blots and blemishes, revealing their deceptions, while they feast with you. So they're suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing, and in part, this could be talking about some of the more earthly aspects. Some of the earthly consequences to sin, perhaps. But that's not exactly the point that he's getting at. He's talking throughout here about some of these eternal punishments and these things that they're going to suffer. So they're suffering wrong as the wage of their wrongdoing, and they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. And so these individuals, they're going about, they're carousing, they're reveling, they're living it up, they're giving into their lusts, they're giving into these sensual passions, and doing so blatantly. They're not ashamed, they're not feeling guilt, or if they are, they're choosing to ignore it and live how they want to live. So they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. Their blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions. These individuals, they were of the church at one point. They were people who were called by the Master. They chose to return back to their old way of living, like a dog returns to its vomit, as we'll talk about later on. And they're putting a blot and a blemish on the church by doing so to the rest of the world, which was talked about over in verse 2, where it says the way of truth will be blasphemed because of these individuals. And so this is something that Peter is getting at, is that God is not a fan of this at all. And he's hitting this over and over because, these individuals are saying, okay, God hasn't struck me down, and he doesn't exist, he just doesn't care. And so Peter's emphasizing here that God does care and that he's going to do something about it. They're putting a blot and a blemish on his people, on the way of truth. They're maligning it. They're twisting these scriptures to their own destruction, and he isn't going to stand for it. Says they're reveling in their deceptions. And so these people, they're making these bold assertions, they're blaspheming against the way of truth, they're blaspheming what God has put forth, and they're having a great time with it. It says they're reveling in their deceptions, they're reveling in these things that they don't understand. They're reveling in their blasphemies. Anyway, going on, says while they feast with you. So again, they're saying all of these things. They're attempting to deceive, or they will, and says while they're feasting with you. Again, calling back to that, these people are going to rise from within them, and that they need to grow in their knowledge and be ready for it. They need to be ready to combat this. They need to be ready to recognize it. And so we have these here. Verse 14, it says they have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. These individuals that are going to crop up, they're living lives that are after their own passions, even in a physical sense as well. It says they've got eyes full of adultery and they're insatiable for sin. They're just going to go and live it up. They're going to live how they want to live. They're going to act how they want to act, with themselves as the authority rather than God. Going on, I'm trying to get through this before we...
And the older or more established that person is in the church, new converts can easily be persuaded to follow them as thinking that they must know what they're doing. They must, okay, I'll follow them. They can be led astray very easily, thinking that their false teaching is,
Right.
Well, and I mean, if Peter, over in verse 3, he says he's writing to them to stir up their sincere mind by way of reminder. He's reminding them of these things that they wouldn't be trapped. And so, like you said, it would be very easy if they didn't keep these things in mind, if they didn't hold to them. It'd be very easy to be led astray. Because, in a sense, from a physical standpoint, the things that they seem to be saying make sense. Saying it's been a moment. When you remove the spiritual realm from the equation, they're saying it's been a moment since Jesus left. Why hasn't he come back now? And so, if you're just looking at it through the eyes of man, that would make sense. But Peter is reminding them, he's stirring up their sincere mind by way of reminder that these things are on a spiritual scale, and they're with God and not men. And so, We're in 14 there. So says they have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls, just like he's saying. They're enticing these individuals that are weaker in the faith, that don't know the same things, that are perhaps less knowledgeable. Unsteady souls, they have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. So their hearts aren't in the right place. They've got these hearts set to do what they want to do, to take what they want to take. These things here says accursed children. Very strong here. These people, they're again calling back to the idea that God doesn't approve of this. God doesn't approve of it, and they're not going to get away with it. Verse 15 says, forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. So he's saying these people here, they've gone off just in the same way that Balaam did way back when. Another example from the Old Testament of one who was seeking to, he was seeking to be paid to curse Israel, right? And so these people here, they're looking for their own gains. They're looking for their own interests rather than God's, and doing so in a way that's wrong. They're doing so through their false teachings, through this way of life, through their false prophecy, and all of these things here. They're following after Balaam in such a way. And then verse 16 says, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrain the prophet's madness. And again, he's saying just like Balaam was rebuked, these false prophets, these false teachers, they're going to be rebuked. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of their rebuke right here that we're reading. So we have this here, and then again continuing on in verse 17. Man, this is a long section. I'm trying to wrap it up just as quick as we can here. Verse 17 says, "These are waterless springs and mists driven by a storm. For them gloom of utter darkness has been reserved." This idea of waterless springs and mist driven by a storm. I mean, we've experienced this quite a bit down here, where you see big old dark clouds and there's just nothing that comes of it, and it just blows right on by. There's no rain in them, or they're blowing past before they drop anything, or a waterless spring. This idea that they're useless. They're clouds without rain, and Jude talks about Jude and 2 Peter are very, very similar in a lot of ways, and Jude has a lot of the same language that he used to describe the false teachers that were already there at that point. Find the place again. It says, "For them gloom of utter darkness has been reserved." Again, hitting back on the idea that God isn't ignoring this. He has reserved a punishment for them. It says gloom of utter darkness. And then in verse 18, "For speaking loud boasts of folly, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error." So again, this idea that these individuals they're loud and they're boasting in foolishness and folly they don't know what they're talking about. And enticing, says, by sensual passions of the flesh, those who are barely escaping. So they're saying to these individuals who are just barely Christians, who are young, who are inexperienced, who are not as strong, they're saying this doesn't matter. Just live how you want to live, which would be, in a lot of ways, very tempting. And so he's saying these individuals, they're trying to draw away those who are just barely escaping. And then verse 19, he says, "They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved." So they're promising these individuals, these weaker in the faith, they're saying, you'll be freed by this. You don't have to live in this way. And they're saying, I'm going to free you from this life that is so constraining, and you can just live however you want to live. They're promising freedom in such a way. But in reality, what they're promising is slavery to sin, to slavery to this corruption, as it says here, which is the same thing that over in verse 5, verse 4, Peter was wanting them to escape by growing in those qualities and by finding a way to heaven and by growing in their knowledge. And so they're drawing these people away to become slaves of sin, slaves of corruption. And this is and it says, for whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. And so these people, these false teachers, are overcome by sin, overcome by the corruption, and they're seeking to draw others down into the mire. And he's saying these individuals have given into this. They're living as slaves to sin, living as slaves to corruption, opposite from how God would have them live. We'll go ahead, and that's where we'll enter tonight. But before I sit down, do we have any more comments or questions? We really blazed through there, but do we have comments or questions before we close? Anything to add?
Notice that their main tool is great swelling words of emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
They have messages that mean nothing,
Yeah.
but they sound good. It's like the tickling the ears that Paul told Timothy would come about. It's the false teacher. If you listen to someone and there's no message. It's just emptiness. It's all good, but there's no meat to it.
Mm-hmm.
That is the thing that's happening here with these false teachers is their words mean nothing, but yet they're enticing. They're appealing to people who don't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
Thus the reason Peter said to grow and to be stronger so that we could see these things and recognize them and recognize these false teachers when they come. And we're not immune to that today. There are many places where people preach, but there's no Bible there. There's no, when I was in college years ago, the congregation had a preacher who had one verse maybe in 30 minutes and 5 jokes.
Yeah.
There was an empty message, but people were following him. And unfortunately, those who are untrained follow that, and they feel good, so they think they've done a good thing by going to church that day.
Mm-hmm.
But there's actually no filling there. No, it's empty. And I think that's verse 18 kind of spells out this whole chapter, that their words are empty, meaningless.
Yeah.
But they allure people with those words.
Mm-hmm. They're promising them nothing.
Yeah.
They're promising them a freedom that they can't grab, that they can't go through with. They're giving them nothing but, I mean, it's right in the title. They're giving them nothing but falsehood. These false teachers and these false prophets, and so they can't deliver on what they promise because there isn't anything there. So, we'll go ahead and close there.
The donkey,
Uh-huh.
I know that it's different, you know, I'm jumping way back, but so that a dumb donkey that speaks with a man's voice, the donkey didn't even make any noise
Yeah, he did.
before it spoke in human voice, right?
No, it was just saying that okay, put it this way. Look at the beginning of that section. These false teachers are like beasts of the field. They're dumb. They just they're made for man to eat and to kill and eat. And then notice at the last of that section, God used a dumb animal that was smarter than these false teachers to stop Balaam from doing what the false teachers were doing. So notice, he tells them, you're like a beast of the field that just goes about living because you're an animal. But then he points out that God used that animal to be smarter than you, the false teacher.
Okay.
Yeah. In the Old Testament, in that passage in Numbers, it says that God opened the donkey's mouth and he spoke to Balaam.
Okay. All right.
But don't miss what Peter